In 1984, BiWay was the most trusted discount store in Canada. Not Zellers, not Woolco. BiWay. The name every working mother in Ontario knew by heart. The place she went when the money had to stretch, and the list couldn't get any shorter. The stores weren't pretty. Fluorescent lights, metal racks, plastic floors. No music worth remembering. No displays worth admiring. But the prices were real. Every single day. At its peak, more than 300 BiWay stores sat in the strip malls and neighborhood plazas of this country. Quiet, unglamorous, and absolutely essential to the families who depended on them. Then one morning in 1994, Walmart opened its doors in Canada. And 7 years later, BiWay was gone. Every location, every fluorescent light, every metal rack, gone. How does a store that never once lied to its customers, never inflated a price, never promised more than it delivered, disappear while the people it served were still counting on it? This is the story of what BiWay was, who built it, who it served, and the forces that took it away from the families who needed it most. Toronto, 1961. The city was growing fast, faster than anyone had planned for. Waves of immigrants from Italy, Portugal, Poland, and Greece were settling into the working neighborhoods west and east of downtown. They came with strong backs, long hours, and very little room in the weekly budget for anything that wasn't necessary. These were not people who shopped for pleasure. They shopped to survive, to clothe their children, to keep a household running on wages that didn't leave much behind at the end of the month. Jack Grower saw that. What he saw, more specifically, was a gap. The big department stores, Eaton's, Simpson's, were built for a different kind of customer. Clean carpets, helpful salespeople, merchandise arranged like it deserved to be admired. Beautiful if you could afford to browse. Out of reach if you couldn't. The small corner shops were close to home but limited in what they carried. A family that needed school clothes for 3 children, dish towels, and a replacement frying pan couldn't get it all done in one place. Not at a price that made sense. Grower's idea was simple enough to fit on a napkin. Build a store that carries what working families actually need. Price everything as low as it can possibly go. Don't spend money on anything the customer doesn't benefit from directly. No fancy fixtures, no elaborate window displays, no salespeople on commission circling the floor. Just goods, just prices, just honesty. The first BiWay opened in Toronto, and it looked exactly like what it was. A no-frills operation that had made a deliberate choice to put every dollar into the merchandise and none of it into the atmosphere. The floors were hard, the lighting was bright and flat, the racks were metal and plain. There was no background music carefully selected to make you feel something. There was nothing, in fact, designed to make you feel anything except confident that you were paying a fair price. That was the whole philosophy. And on the first day, the women who walked through that door understood it immediately. A mother from the Azores, still learning English, didn't need a translator to read a price tag. A Polish grandmother who had been budgeting household money for 40 years didn't need a salesperson to explain value to her. They walked in, looked at the numbers, looked at the merchandise, and knew. This place was for them. One woman, according to a story that circulated for years among early BiWay employees, came in that first week to buy school shirts for her 2 sons. She had budgeted carefully. She knew exactly what she could spend. She picked up the shirts, carried them to the register, and when the total came up, she had enough left over for a 3rd shirt she hadn't planned on. She stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the change in her hand. Then she went back and got the 3rd shirt. That moment, a woman returning to the rack because she could, because the math worked out better than she had dared to hope, was what BiWay was built for. Not the transaction, the extra shirt, the small, quiet relief of discovering that this time, unlike so many other times, there was enough. Jack Grower wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to build a store that working people could count on. For 40 years, that is exactly what BiWay was. And for 40 years it worked. The decade that defined BiWay was the 1980s, not because the stores were at their largest, though they were growing steadily, not because the prices were the lowest they had ever been. though they remained the lowest in the neighborhood. The 1980s defined BiWay because that was the decade when going there became a ritual. Something families did not just out of necessity, but out of habit, out of trust, out of a quiet, unspoken loyalty that nobody had to think about because it had simply become part of how life worked. Every August, without fail, it started the same way. A mother made a list, not a wish list, a real list. Practical, numbered, budgeted to the dollar. School pants for the oldest, shirts for the middle one, socks because socks always wore out. Maybe a jacket if the one from last year had gotten too small. She folded the list, put it in her purse, and on a Saturday morning she loaded the kids into the car or walked them down the block, and she went to BiWay. The parking lot was already half full by 9 in the morning. Inside, the air was cool, the kind of institutional cool that came from an old HVAC system doing its job without any elegance whatsoever. The lights were fluorescent and bright, the kind of light that showed everything clearly and flattered nothing. The floors were hard underfoot, a practical laminate that had seen 10,000 shopping carts and showed it. And it smelled like new things. Fabric, mostly. The clean, synthetic smell of polyester shirts still in their packaging, of cotton blend pants folded on shelves, of plastic-wrapped socks in their 3-packs. Mixed underneath that, faintly, the smell of cardboard from stock that had just been unpacked, and somewhere near the back, something that might have been rubber from the bin of discounted sneakers that always seemed to be there, regardless of the season. The racks were metal and industrial, arranged in long, straight rows with signs overhead that told you exactly where everything was. Children's, women's, men's, housewares, seasonal. The signs weren't decorative. They were functional, plain black letters on white background, because that was all they needed to be. You went to the section you needed. You found what was on your list. You checked the price. It was already as low as it was going to be. No sale required, no coupon needed, and you put it in your cart. That was it. That was BiWay. And somehow, for millions of families across Ontario and beyond, that was enough. More than enough. The children who were dragged along on those Saturday morning runs remember the toy section. It was never the largest toy department in any city. It couldn't compete with what Sears or Eaton's put together at Christmas, but it was there, tucked toward the back or along one wall, and it had things, actual toys, reasonably priced, and a child standing in front of it experienced the same arithmetic that their mother experienced at the shirt rack. Maybe there was enough. Maybe this time the math worked out. The employees who worked those floors through the 1980s were, in many cases, from the same neighborhoods as the customers they served, women who had come from the same countries, attended the same churches, sent their children to the same schools. They knew the regulars by name. They knew which families came in every August like clockwork, and which mothers always checked the clearance rack first, and which little boy always went straight to the same corner of the toy section. There was nothing glamorous about working at BiWay. The pay was modest, the hours were often part-time, and the work was physical. Stocking, organizing, running a register through a rush that peaked on Saturday mornings and in the weeks before school started. But there was something in it that many of those employees have described the same way decades later. It felt like the store meant something. Not to the company's shareholders, not to some executive in a downtown office. It meant something to the people walking through the door. And that was legible, present, real. A cashier who rang through a mother's purchase and watched the relief cross her face when the total came in, under budget, understood, without needing anyone to explain it, what this store was for. BiWay showed up in local newspaper advertisements. Simple, undesigned, just a list of items and their prices. No photography, no lifestyle imagery, no aspirational language about the kind of person you could become if you wore these clothes. Just pants, $6.99, shirts, $4.49, socks, 3 pairs for $2. The ads were almost aggressively plain, and they worked precisely because of that. The customer who saw a BiWay ad knew that the price in the paper was the price on the tag. No asterisks, no fine print, no limited quantities available at select locations only. What you saw was what it cost, every time. That consistency, that reliability, is what built the loyalty. Not excitement, not aspiration, not the thrill of a great deal discovered by luck. Just the steady, dependable knowledge that BiWay would not waste your time or your money, and that when you walked out with your bags, you had gotten exactly what you came for. What was it about those fluorescent lights and metal racks that made a generation of Canadians remember the place 40 years later with something that can only be called affection? It wasn't the store itself. It was what the store made possible. The third shirt, the jacket that fit this year, the school supplies bought without having to choose between them and something else the family needed. BiWay didn't sell dreams. It delivered on something harder to find and more valuable. A promise, kept every single time. By the early 1990s, that promise had been kept for 30 years. The children who had been dragged to BiWay on Saturday mornings were adults now, some of them with children of their own. And some of them, without thinking much about it, were loading their own kids into the car on a Saturday morning and heading to the same kind of store. The orange and white sign was familiar. The fluorescent light was familiar. The smell of new fabric and cardboard was familiar. Everything was as it had always been. What nobody could see yet, not the mothers with their lists, not the cashiers who knew them by name, not the managers who had worked those floors for 15 years, was that the world BiWay had been built for was about to change in ways the store was not equipped to survive. BiWay did not expand the way ambitious companies expand. There were no press conferences, no bold announcements about conquering new markets, no glossy annual reports celebrating another 100 locations opened ahead of schedule. BiWay grew the way a practical person does most things, quietly, carefully, one step at a time, only when the next step made sense. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, new stores appeared in the working neighborhoods of Toronto and the cities surrounding it. Mississauga, Hamilton, Brampton, Oshawa. Not downtown where the rent was high and the foot traffic belonged to a different kind of shopper. BiWay went where its customers lived, the strip malls and neighborhood plazas that line the arterial roads of Ontario's expanding suburbs, the commercial strips that served communities of factory workers, tradespeople, and recent immigrants building their lives in a new country. The location strategy was deliberate. BiWay didn't chase prestige addresses, it chased proximity. A store that a mother could reach on a Saturday morning without driving 20 minutes, that sat next to a grocery store or a pharmacy, that had parking and didn't require a trip to the mall. That was the right location. Not the most visible corner, not the highest traffic intersection, but the right neighborhood, the right community, the right customers. Every new store looked like every other store. That was also deliberate. The layout didn't change, the signage didn't change. The lighting, the racks, the floor, identical from one location to the next. A woman who had shopped at the BiWay in Scarborough for 5 years and then moved to Burlington could walk into the Burlington store on her first visit and know exactly where everything was. The children's section was where it always was. The housewares were where they always were. The clearance rack was always somewhere near the back. That consistency was not an accident. It was a management decision that reflected the same philosophy the founding store had been built on. Don't complicate it, don't reinvent it. The model works, repeat it. By the early 1980s, BiWay had expanded well beyond Ontario. Stores appeared in British Columbia, in Alberta, in Quebec. The specific numbers shifted across the decade as some locations closed and new ones opened. But by the mid-1980s, BiWay was operating well over 200 locations across the country, moving steadily toward the 300 mark that would represent its peak. For the communities receiving those new stores, the arrival of a BiWay was a practical event, not a celebrated one. There was no grand opening fanfare, no ribbon cutting with local dignitaries. A store opened, the sign went up, and the women with lists found out about it the way people found out about most things in those neighborhoods. Someone told someone else, an ad ran in the local paper, and by the second Saturday, it was already part of the routine. The people hired to staff those new locations came from the same communities. That was not a corporate diversity initiative. It was simply how BiWay operated. You hired locally because local people knew the neighborhood, knew the customers, and in many cases were the customers. A woman who shopped at a store on her days off and worked there on the others understood what the job was for in a way that no amount of training could replicate. What was being built, store by store through those years, was something more durable than market share. It was institutional trust, not the kind that gets built through advertising campaigns or loyalty programs, but the kind that accumulates slowly through thousands of small kept promises. The price that matched the ad, the item that was in stock, the cashier who got the total right and made change without making the customer feel hurried. But expansion, even careful expansion, carries its own pressures. Each new store required capital. Each new location required management. The supply chain that worked efficiently for 50 stores had to be stretched to serve 200, then 300. Inventory systems that were adequate in 1970 were showing their age by 1985. The infrastructure of the company was growing, but it was growing behind the stores rather than ahead of them. In the short term, none of this was visible. The stores were busy, the prices were holding, the customers were coming back. There was no reason, standing in a BiWay in 1986 and watching the Saturday morning rush move through the checkout lines, to suspect that anything was wrong. The model was working, the expansion was working, everything was working. And somewhere in that success, in the confidence that a formula proven over 25 years would continue to perform, a set of decisions were not being made, investments were not being prioritized, systems were not being modernized. The company that had been built on relentless practicality was, in one specific and eventually fatal way, not being practical at all. It was assuming that the world BiWay had been built for would remain the world BiWay operated in. It wouldn't. By the late 1980s, BiWay was no longer just a store. It had become something harder to define and more difficult to replace, a fixed point in the landscape of working-class Canadian life. Not a landmark in the way that a cathedral or a courthouse is a landmark in the way that a kitchen table is a landmark, unremarkable until it's gone, irreplaceable once it is. More than 300 locations across 6 provinces, serving communities that range from the immigrant neighborhoods of Toronto to the mid-sized cities of the interior, to the smaller towns where BiWay was sometimes the only affordable retail option within reasonable distance. The peak had been reached quietly, the way BiWay did everything. No announcement, no celebration. One day there were 300 stores, and that was simply the size of what BiWay had become. What made that number mean something was not the count itself, but what each of those locations represented in the community around it. BiWay was not an anchor tenant in a regional shopping mall drawing customers from a 40-mile radius. It was a neighborhood store, one of many in a plaza, serving the people who lived within a few miles, woven into the weekly rhythm of ordinary life, in a way that required no special occasion to activate. You didn't go to BiWay for an experience. You went because you needed something and BiWay had it at a price you could manage. That distinction mattered more than it might appear. Stores built around experience depend on the customer being in the mood, feeling good, feeling flush, feeling like spending time as well as money. BiWay made no such demands. It was there when you needed it. It had what you needed, and it let you leave with your money mostly intact. That was the entire transaction. And yet something accumulated across those transactions, across years and decades of them, that was not purely practical. Families passed BiWay down, not intentionally, not as a conscious act of transmission, but in the way that any repeated experience becomes part of the texture of a childhood. A woman who had shopped at BiWay since her own children were small found, years later, that those children shopped there too. Not because anyone told them to, because it was familiar, because the fluorescent lights in the metal racks and the flat, honest pricing felt like something they already knew how to navigate. There were grandmothers in Ontario in the early 1990s who had been shopping at BiWay for 20 years, whose daughters had grown up tagging along on those Saturday runs, and whose grandchildren were now old enough to push the cart. 3 generations moving through the same store, in the same neighborhood, doing the same practical, necessary thing. That is not brand loyalty in the way marketing textbooks describe it. That is something older and more durable. That is a place becoming part of how a family understands what taking care of each other looks like. The employees who worked at BiWay through its peak years were themselves part of that fabric. Many had been there for a decade or more. They knew which customers came in every August before school started, which older women always checked the clearance rack before anything else, which kids made a beeline for the toy section the moment they cleared the entrance. They knew because they were paying attention, not because a training manual told them to pay attention, because these were their neighbors, and the work felt like it meant something beyond the transaction. A store manager who had run a BiWay location in Hamilton through most of the 1980s described it years later in simple terms. The customers who came to his store were not there because they wanted to be. They were there because they had to be. And his job, the way he understood it, was to make sure that the experience of having to be there was as dignified as possible. Prices that were real, shelves that were stocked, staff that didn't make you feel like your budget was something to be ashamed of. That was the standard. And for most of its peak years, BiWay met it. When BiWay ran advertisements in those years, and the ads were always in local newspapers, always simple, always just items and prices, there was no language about lifestyle or aspiration or becoming a better version of yourself through your purchasing choices. There was a list of things the store had and what they cost. The customers who read those ads trusted them completely, not because BiWay had earned that trust through a marketing strategy, but because BiWay had earned it the only way trust is actually earned, by being honest repeatedly over a very long period of time. That trust, built over 30 years, was the most valuable thing BiWay possessed. It was also, as it turned out, the one thing that could not protect the company from what was coming. Because what was coming didn't care about trust. It didn't care about 30 years of kept promises or 3 generations of Saturday morning shopping trips or the dignified transaction between a store and the community it served. What was coming cared about price, and it had capabilities that BiWay had never imagined and could not match. The date was January 14, 1994. That was the day Walmart officially entered Canada, not by building its first store and waiting to see what happened, but by acquiring 122 Woolco locations in a single transaction and converting them almost overnight into Walmart stores. 122 locations across the country, operational within months. It was not a test. It was not a gradual introduction. It was an arrival, the kind that changes the landscape permanently and leaves no time for the competition to prepare, because the preparation would have needed to happen years earlier to matter at all. For BiWay, the timing could not have been worse. The company had spent 30 years building something real and valuable: a network of stores, a loyal customer base, a reputation for honest pricing that had never once been compromised. All of that was genuine. All of it had been earned, and none of it was a defense against what Walmart brought across the border. Walmart's supply chain in 1994 was unlike anything operating in Canadian retail. The company had spent decades and billions of dollars building a logistics network that could move merchandise from manufacturer to store shelf faster and cheaper than any competitor in the world. Its inventory systems were computerized in ways that most Canadian retailers had not yet implemented. Its buying power, the sheer volume it purchased from suppliers, allowed it to negotiate prices that smaller chains could not access regardless of how efficiently they operated. BiWay's promise to its customers had always been the lowest price in the neighborhood. That promise had been kept for 30 years through careful buying, tight operations, and a genuine commitment to the model Jack Grower had built in 1961. But BiWay's lowest price and Walmart's lowest price were not the same number. They could not be. The infrastructure didn't exist at BiWay to make them the same number. In the months after Walmart opened, the customers noticed. Not all of them, and not immediately. Many of the women who had shopped at BiWay for a decade or more continued to shop there out of habit. The store was familiar, the staff was familiar, the routine was familiar. But when they walked into a Walmart for the first time, they saw the same categories of merchandise they bought at BiWay. And in many cases, the prices were lower. Not dramatically, not on everything, but enough. Enough to make them think. enough to make them come back. Inside BiWay, the response to Walmart's arrival was measured and, in retrospect, insufficient. Prices were reviewed, some adjustments were made, management monitored the traffic numbers and noted the softening without fully reckoning with what it meant. The problem was not that BiWay's leadership was incompetent. The problem was that the competitive gap between the two companies was structural, built into the supply chains, the inventory systems, the capital available for investment, and structural problems cannot be solved by adjusting prices on a spreadsheet. They require the kind of investment and transformation that takes years and costs more money than a company carrying existing debt can easily mobilize. BiWay was not, in 1994, a company with a great deal of financial flexibility. Its parent company, Dilex Corporation, was a Toronto-based retail conglomerate that owned a collection of Canadian clothing chains. Tip Top Tailors, Fairweather, Braemar, and others alongside BiWay. By the mid-1990s, several of those chains were struggling. The retail environment across Canada was shifting, and Dilex was feeling the pressure across its entire portfolio. That meant the resources available to BiWay for modernization, for supply chain investment, for the kind of transformation that might have allowed the company to compete more effectively with Walmart, were constrained by the performance of brands that had nothing to do with discount retail. BiWay was, in many ways, the healthiest part of the Dilex portfolio, and it was being asked to exist within a structure that was not healthy at all. The customers shopping at BiWay in 1995 and 1996 did not know any of this. They came in on Saturday mornings as they always had. The stores looked the same. The staff was largely the same. The prices were still reasonable, still honest, still lower than most places in the neighborhood. But the shelves, some longtime shoppers began to notice, were not always as fully stocked as they used to be. Restocking took a little longer. The selection in certain categories, children's clothing especially, seemed slightly narrower than it had been a few years before. Small things, easy to dismiss. The kind of changes that, taken individually, mean nothing, but taken together over several months begin to add up to a feeling that something is different. Something is not quite right. How long could a store this trusted, serving customers this loyal, hold on against a competitor that had simply outgrown the same competitive space by an order of magnitude? The answer was already being written in the quarterly reports that the customers never saw, in the board meetings at Dilex headquarters, in the supply agreements that were becoming harder to maintain at the margins BiWay needed to survive. The fluorescent lights were still on. The metal racks were still full enough. The cashiers still knew the regulars by name. But the ground under BiWay had shifted, and the store, the staff, the customers, the communities that depended on it, had no idea how little time was left. To understand what happened to BiWay in its final years, it is necessary to understand Dilex Corporation. Dilex was not a retailer in the way BiWay was a retailer. BiWay was built around a single, clear idea: sell essential goods to working families at the lowest honest price, and it had executed that idea with remarkable consistency for 30 years. Dilex was something different. It was a holding company, a portfolio of brands assembled over decades through acquisition, each one operating in a different segment of Canadian retail, each one with its own identity, its own customer base, its own set of challenges. At its peak, Dilex was one of the largest retail conglomerates in Canada. The portfolio included Tip Top Tailors, the men's clothing chain that had dressed Canadian workers for generations, Fairweather and Braemar, women's clothing brands aimed at the mid-market, Harry Rosen, the upscale men's retailer at the premium end of the spectrum, and BiWay, the discount operation that served the customers none of the other brands were built for. On paper, the combination made a kind of sense. In practice, it created a structural problem that would prove fatal to more than one of those brands. When a conglomerate owns multiple retail chains and several of them begin to struggle simultaneously, the pressure falls on the ones that are still performing. Resources get redirected. Capital that might have been invested in modernizing a healthy brand gets absorbed by the effort to stabilize the unhealthy ones. The strong are asked to subsidize the weak, and in the process they become less strong. By the early 1990s, several Dialex brands were in serious difficulty. The mid-market women's clothing segment was under pressure from shifting consumer tastes and increasing competition. The men's clothing business was contracting. Dialex was carrying debt, facing declining performance across multiple divisions, and managing a portfolio that had become too complex to navigate effectively in a retail environment that was itself changing rapidly. BiWay was not the source of those problems. BiWay was, relative to the rest of the portfolio, still functioning. But BiWay existed inside the Dialect structure, and that structure was under enormous strain. The investments that BiWay needed, modernized inventory systems, supply chain improvements, store refreshes that would have kept the locations competitive in appearance and efficiency, were not made. Not because BiWay's management didn't understand the need, but because the capital wasn't available. It was spoken for elsewhere, absorbed by the larger corporate challenges that Dialex was facing on multiple fronts simultaneously. This is the decision that, in hindsight, proved fatal. Not a single dramatic choice made in a single room on a single day. A series of deferrals, an accumulation of investments not made, systems not upgraded, improvements not funded. Each one individually justifiable given the pressures of the moment. Collectively, they left BiWay standing in 1994, the year Walmart arrived, with infrastructure that had not kept pace with what the competitive environment now required. Walmart's inventory system in 1994 was tracking sales in real time, restocking shelves based on data, and negotiating with suppliers on the basis of purchase volumes that dwarfed anything in Canadian retail. BiWay was running on systems that had been adequate in the 1980s and were visibly inadequate now. The gap was not closable through effort or intention. It required capital investment on a scale that Dialex, in its condition, could not provide. In 1995, Dialex Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. The filing was the result of years of accumulated pressure, debt, declining performance across multiple brands, a retail environment that had shifted faster than the company had adapted. For BiWay, the immediate consequence was operational uncertainty. For the employees who had built careers at the company, it was the first moment when the future became genuinely unclear. BiWay emerged from the Dialex bankruptcy as a separate entity, restructured and theoretically independent. But independence in this case meant inheriting the weakness without the support. The company that came out of the restructuring was carrying the effects of years of underinvestment. Operating in a market now dominated by a competitor it could not match on price, with no clear path to the capital it would need to close the gap. The stores continued to operate. The staff continued to show up. The customers continued to come, though in smaller numbers and with slightly less certainty than before. From the outside, BiWay still looked like BiWay. The sign was still there. The lights were still on. The prices were still honest. But inside the company, the people who understood the numbers knew what the numbers were saying. The trajectory was not recoverable through ordinary means. The business was losing ground in every direction that mattered. Customer traffic, margin, the ability to compete on the fundamental promise that had built the brand in the first place. The employees on the floor knew something was wrong before anyone told them officially. They felt it in the way store managers stopped talking freely about long-term plans, in the way certain product categories quietly disappeared from the shelves and were not replaced, in the way corporate communications became less frequent and less specific. A woman who had worked at a BiWay location in Mississauga for 11 years described the feeling in the late 1990s as something like watching a house settle. Nothing dramatic, no single moment of crisis, just a slow, almost imperceptible shift. A door that used to close cleanly now catching slightly on the frame. A window that used to open smoothly now sticking in its track. Everything still working, technically, but not the way it used to work. The customers who had depended on BiWay for decades were not being served less honestly than they had ever been served. The prices were still real. The merchandise was still what it was advertised to be. But the selection was narrower. The shelves were not always as full. The experience of shopping there carried, for the first time, a faint undertone of uncertainty. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had spent 30 years building this? The cashiers who had worked those registers since the 1970s, the stock clerks who knew every inch of every aisle, the store managers who had given the best years of their working lives to a company that was now being slowly hollowed out by forces well above their pay grade and entirely outside their control? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody. The system that was supposed to protect them, the corporate structure, the ownership, the institutions designed to ensure that workers were treated fairly when businesses failed, would prove in the years ahead to be far less reliable than the store itself had ever been. BiWay had never once broken its promise to its customers. The same could not be said of what was coming next. The announcement came in 2001, not with drama, not with a press conference or a public statement that gave the communities depending on BiWay time to prepare. The news moved the way bad news usually moves through retail, quietly at first in the form of rumors that the people on the floor had already half believed for months, and then all at once, officially, in language that meant the same thing regardless of how carefully it was worded. BiWay was closing, all of it, every location. The company filed for creditor protection and announced that it would be liquidating its entire operation. There would be no restructuring this time, no emergence as a leaner version of what it had been. There would be no buyer stepping in to preserve the brand or the jobs or the stores. There would be a liquidation sale, and then there would be nothing. For the employees who had been watching the slow deterioration through the late 1990s, the announcement was not a surprise. It was a confirmation of something they had already come to understand in the way that people understand things they don't want to be true, reluctantly, incrementally, and without any of the closure that an official announcement is supposed to provide. For the customers, many of whom had simply continued shopping at their local BiWay out of habit and loyalty and the absence of a better alternative, the news landed differently. These were not people who followed retail industry news. They were not tracking quarterly earnings reports or reading business section coverage of Dilex's bankruptcy proceedings. They had walked into their BiWay last Saturday, bought what they needed, and walked out. The store had been there, the lights had been on, the prices had been honest, and now it was closing. The liquidation sales began. If you were there for one of those sales, and across Canada in 2001, hundreds of thousands of people were, you understood immediately that a liquidation sale at a store like BiWay was a particular kind of experience. Not the excitement of a clearance event at a store you visited occasionally for pleasure. Something heavier than that. Something that felt, from the moment you walked in, like an ending. The merchandise was marked down in stages. 30% off everything, then 50, then 70. The signs were hand-lettered in some locations, printed in others, but the message was the same everywhere. This inventory needs to move because there is no tomorrow for it to move in. The racks that had always been organized and fully stocked were beginning to show gaps. Items that had sold were not being replaced. The children's section, which in August of any normal year would have been restocked twice a week to keep up with back-to-school demand, was thinning. The housewares aisle had holes in it. The toy section, already modest, was nearly bare. Shopping carts moved through those aisles with a different energy than they had moved through them in better years. Some customers were there for the discounts, genuinely hunting for value in the clearance, filling their carts with marked-down merchandise the way you do when the math is suddenly in your favor. But others were there for a reason that had nothing to do with the prices. They were there because this was their store, and they wanted to see it one more time before it was gone. They wanted to walk the aisles they had walked for 20 years and let the familiarity of it settle over them in a way that would have to last. A woman who had shopped at a BiWay in Scarborough since the mid-1970s described going to the liquidation sale with her adult daughter. The same daughter she had brought along as a small child on those Saturday morning runs 3 decades earlier. They didn't buy much. The daughter bought a set of dish towels. The mother bought a package of socks. They walked through the whole store before they left, slowly, and neither of them said very much. On the day the employees were told their locations were closing, the news came through store managers who had often known it was coming, but had been waiting for the official word before they could say anything. The meetings were brief. The language was corporate and careful. The practical information, final paychecks, severance where applicable, the process for collecting personal belongings was delivered alongside the news itself because there was no point in separating them. What followed those meetings in break rooms and parking lots and in the phone calls made on the drive home was not anger, mostly. It was something quieter and harder to name. People who had worked at the same location for 10, 12, 15 years were now trying to calculate what came next. Resumes that hadn't been updated in a decade. References from managers who were themselves out of work. Skills built entirely within a retail context that was itself collapsing. The job market they were entering was not the job market they had left when they first walked into a BiWay to apply for work. A cashier who had been at the same BiWay location in Hamilton for 14 years said later that the hardest part was not the last day. The last day had a kind of finality to it that was almost a relief after months of uncertainty. The hardest part was the morning after, waking up and understanding that the routine that had structured her days for 14 years was simply gone, and that nothing was waiting to replace it. The final locations closed in the months following the initial announcement. The signs came down. The remaining merchandise was cleared out. The metal racks were sold or removed. The lights were turned off. In some locations, the space sat empty for months before a new tenant moved in. A dollar store in one plaza, a discount gym in another, a church that needed space in a third. The buildings were still there. The same footprints, the same parking lots, the same position in the same neighborhoods. But the thing that had given those spaces meaning for a generation of shoppers was gone, and whatever came next did not carry the same weight. The mall anchors and big box competitors that had contributed to BiWay's decline did not mourn its passing. The industry moved on without ceremony, the way industries always do. A press release here, a brief mention in the business pages there, and then the silence of a story that had ended and would not be revisited. What do we lose when a store like BiWay closes? Not a destination, not an experience, but a reliable, honest, unglamorous place that asked nothing of you except the money you were already prepared to spend and gave you back exactly what it promised? The neighborhoods where BiWay had operated didn't suddenly become retail deserts. There were other stores. There were other options. But the options were not the same. The dollar stores that moved into some of those spaces sold cheaper goods at prices that were not always as honest as they appeared. The big box alternatives required a car and time, and the willingness to navigate a scale of retail that had never been designed for someone buying 3 shirts and a package of socks. The specific thing BiWay had been. Neighborhood scaled, honestly priced, staffed by people from the community, requiring nothing beyond what you actually needed, did not have a replacement. It had a series of approximations, each one missing something that the original had provided. The lights in those stores went dark one by one through 2001 and into 2002, and the Canada that existed on the other side of those closures was, in a small but genuine way, different from the Canada that had existed before. Not catastrophically different, not visibly different to anyone who hadn't depended on those stores, but different. When the last BiWay closed, nobody held a ceremony. There was no public memorial, no acknowledgement from civic leaders, no moment of collective recognition that something had been lost beyond a business filing. The stores closed, the spaces emptied, and the communities that had organized part of their practical lives around those locations were left to make whatever adjustments they could with whatever alternatives were available. The adjustments were not always clean. In the neighborhoods where BiWay had been the closest affordable retail option, the working-class strips and modest plazas of Ontario's mid-sized cities and inner suburbs, the question of what replaced it did not have a satisfying answer. Dollar stores moved into some locations. They carried some of the same product categories at prices that appeared comparable, but frequently were not. Smaller quantities, lower quality, a pricing structure designed to look like value while delivering less of it than it appeared. Walmart was there for those who could reach it, but Walmart required transportation, and it was scaled for a kind of shopping trip that took 2 hours rather than 20 minutes. The woman who had walked to her local BiWay to pick up 3 items on a Tuesday afternoon did not have a direct equivalent in the retail landscape that followed. The specific convenience BiWay had provided, neighborhood-scaled, walkable, in many cases, stocked with genuine essentials at honest prices, was not replaced. It was approximated imperfectly by a combination of options, none of which individually did what BiWay had done. The employees who lost their jobs in 2001 did not have the safety net that workers at larger, longer-established institutions sometimes carried. BiWay's workforce was largely part-time, largely female, largely drawn from the same working-class communities the stores had served. Severance where it existed was modest. Pensions were not a feature of retail employment at this level. The workers who had given 10 or 15 years to the company received what the law required and very little beyond it. Many of them moved into the retail sector that had contributed to BiWay's decline. Walmart was hiring. Dollar stores were expanding. The work was familiar: stocking, cashiering, managing inventory. But the context was different. The neighborhood connection that had made BiWay feel like something more than a job was not a feature of the big box environment. You were not serving your neighbors in the same way. You were processing transactions at a scale that made individual relationships with customers nearly impossible. Some workers left retail entirely. Others reduced their hours and supplemented with other part-time work. The institutional knowledge they carried, years of understanding a specific community's shopping patterns, a specific store's rhythms, the particular needs of the customers who came in every week, evaporated. There was nowhere for that knowledge to go. The attempt to revive the BiWay brand, if there was one, did not gain traction. The name changed hands in the aftermath of the bankruptcy proceedings, as brand assets typically do when a company liquidates. But no serious effort to rebuild BiWay as a functioning retail operation emerged. The economics that had made BiWay viable, the specific cost structure, the real estate environment, the competitive landscape, had shifted too far for a simple relaunch to make sense. The window that BiWay had occupied in Canadian retail had been closed, and closed permanently, by the forces that had ended the original company. What BiWay's collapse illustrated, more clearly than most retail failures of that era, was the specific vulnerability of the middle tier. BiWay had never been the cheapest store in Canada in absolute terms. It had been the most honestly priced store at its level. It had also never been a destination for shoppers seeking variety or experience or aspiration. It existed in a specific space between the dollar store and the department store, serving customers who needed more than one offered and less than the other required. When Walmart arrived with the ability to undercut BiWay on price while offering greater variety, that space collapsed. The customers who had been loyal to BiWay because it was the best available option in their range were now making a rational choice. Not because they had stopped valuing what BiWay had given them, but because something that offered more of the same things at a lower price had arrived within reach. Loyalty built on reliable delivery of a specific value proposition does not survive when a competitor delivers the same value proposition more efficiently. That is not a failure of loyalty. It is simply the logic of how markets work, applied to people who could not afford the luxury of preferring a store on sentimental grounds when the bills still needed to be paid. The broader retail industry absorbed this lesson imperfectly. The companies that survived the Walmart effect in Canada and the United States were the ones that found a way to occupy a space Walmart could not or would not fill. Extreme value at the very low end, strong brand identity at the premium end, or a specific product focus narrow enough that Walmart's general merchandise model couldn't replicate it. BiWay had none of those defenses. It was general merchandise, mid-range, serving customers on the basis of price and trust. When a competitor arrived that could match the price and had the scale to sustain it indefinitely, the trust alone was not enough to keep the doors open. What do we lose when a place that served people who had few options disappears, and nothing that replaces it serves those people in quite the same way? The question did not receive a public answer in 2001. It rarely does. The people most affected by the loss of a store like BiWay are not the people most likely to be consulted about what the loss means. They are the people who simply find one day that the place they depended on is gone. and then figure out, quietly and without much help, what to do next. Go back one more time. A Saturday morning in August, somewhere in Ontario. The year is 1988. The parking lot is already filling up when a mother arrives with her two children, one old enough to push the cart, one still young enough to want to ride in it. She has her list. She has always had her list. It is written on a folded piece of paper in her purse, practical and specific, the product of a week's worth of thinking about what the family needs and what the budget will allow. She pushes through the door and the cool air comes out to meet her. That particular institutional cool, the kind that belongs to grocery stores and schools, and places that exist to serve a function rather than to impress. The fluorescent lights are already bright overhead. The floor stretches ahead of her in its familiar grid of metal racks and clear signage. The smell is what she remembers from every other time she has been here. Fabric, cardboard, something clean and unpretentious that she has never tried to name because it has simply always been the smell of this place. She knows where everything is. She has always known where everything is. The older child pushes the cart. The younger one asks about the toy section. She says maybe and she means it, because at BiWay, maybe is a real answer. Maybe the math works out. Maybe there is enough left at the end. She moves through the store with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times and values her Saturday morning. Children's first. The shirts are where they always are. The prices are what she expected them to be. Honest, unchanged from the flyer, exactly what was advertised. She checks sizes. She makes decisions. She puts things in the cart and does not second-guess them because there is nothing to second-guess. The price is the price. By the time she reaches the register, the cart holds everything on her list and the math has worked out. It has almost always worked out at BiWay. That is the thing she would find hardest to explain to someone who had never needed it to work out. The specific relief of a store that does not surprise you, that does not inflate and discount and inflate again, that simply charges what things cost and lets you plan your life accordingly. The cashier rings her through. They have seen each other enough times that there is a nod, something approaching familiarity without requiring conversation. The total appears. She pays. She takes her bags. On the way out, she stops at the toy section. The math has worked out. There is enough. BiWay was never a store that asked to be loved. It did not have a mascot or a jingle or a catalog that arrived in the mail like a seasonal promise. It did not have a Christmas display that made children stop walking and stand in silence. It did not have a restaurant counter where families lingered after shopping, or a credit card that made you feel like a member of something. It had prices that were real. It had shelves that were stocked. It had staff who came from the same neighborhoods as the people they served, who understood without being told what it meant to shop on a budget that did not leave room for error. What BiWay provided was not glamorous. It was not the kind of retail experience that gets written about with affection in the press or remembered with warmth in popular culture. There are no movies set in BiWay. There are no songs about the fluorescent lights or the metal racks or the smell of new fabric under institutional lighting. But there are people, millions of them, scattered across the country that BiWay served for 40 years, who remember what it felt like to walk into that store when they needed to, and walk out with what they came for and feel that the transaction had been fair, that they had been treated with the specific dignity of not being taken advantage of, that the store had kept its promise, the same promise it had always kept, and that this reliability, this quiet, unglamorous, absolute reliability, had made their lives a little more manageable in a way they had not needed to think about because it had simply always been true. When it stopped being true, the adjustment was practical. People found other stores. They made other arrangements. Life continued, as it always does, because it has no other option. But something was gone that did not come back. Not a building, not a brand, not a retail concept that the industry could revive with the right investor and the right timing. Something harder to replace than any of those things. A place that a specific kind of person, living a specific kind of life, could count on. Not to inspire them, not to entertain them, not to make them feel wealthy or aspirational or like a better version of themselves. Just to be there, just to be honest, just to make the Saturday morning work out. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing BiWay to a person who never knew it. They are not describing the store design or the corporate history or the competitive dynamics of Canadian discount retail in the 1990s. They are describing the feeling of the math working out. The younger one got a toy that day, and the family went home.